Hello, and welcome to the Trust Elevation for Online Transactions Best Practices webinar. My name is Dee Shore. I am the moderator today. We have two speakers, Peter Alterman, who's the COO of Safe Biopharma Association, and Abby Barbier. He is the Senior Security Architect at Bank of America. Just a few tips for the attendees to navigate your dashboard during the webinar, to reduce or expand your control panel to kind of get it out of your way so you can see the presentation better. There is an orange arrow on the tab. Just click on that and your dashboard will decrease in size. We will be taking questions throughout the webinar, and feel free to type those questions in as they occur to you. And again, we will take those all at the end. Here is my email address. Feel free to contact me after the webinar, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. This webinar is being recorded, and I will also send a follow-up email with the link where you can download the webinar. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Peter.
Well, good morning, everybody. Let's see. Show my screen. And let's see. Here's the PowerPoint. Are we all good?
Very good.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thanks. And thank you all for joining us this morning. One of the things we want to do is we really want to get you familiar with and comfortable with commenting on the third deliverable document that this Trust Elevation Technical Committee has out in draft right now, because it's a significant document, and we believe it will impact a lot of identity management trust processes moving forward. So we're going to talk about the document and discuss it in a little bit of depth, not geek depth. And we also want to give you some background on this Trust Elevation Technical Committee and where this whole thing came from and where the idea proceeded from. So with that in mind, let's talk about what we mean by trust elevation. This is the traditional assumptions that we're working with model. And they're right there. Increasing the trust a relying party has that the online entity accessing its resources is the person or device it claims to be. That's trust elevation. It's also reducing the risk that a relying party assumes that the online entity accessing its resources is not the person or device. So it's the mirror image. The important thing is that with the second bullet is that it introduces the relationship between risk mitigation, and trust elevation. And that's very important going forward. So that's what we mean. This slide is what we mean by trust elevation. And here's the core model that we created. That was the conceptual model we pretty much all had in our minds as we moved forward trying to codify both the current practices and future directions for trust elevation. So if you start on the upper left-hand box, you have a user. This is a really random kind of flow document, so just bear with it. And I hope you can all see the colors. The user accesses an online resource with its identity or attribute data. Now, this may be in the form of a credential, or it may be in some other form, because the trust elevation is an effective method, regardless of whether it's transactional trust or credential-based trust, and we can talk about that later on. So anyway, the user accesses that online resource, it's the app or your portal or whatever, and at that point the resource assesses the trustworthiness of that assertion of identity. Well, how much does it believe that the the credential really is asserting who you are. And that's important because the resource has to determine beforehand what its risk profile is. If this is something like, if this resource is nothing more than handing out IRS forms, well, then you really don't care who's accessing the system. Anybody can come in and download IRS forms, doesn't matter. I mean, you can be a Bulgarian citizen and do that, and, what the hell, IRS doesn't care. But if, in fact, you are my angry second ex-wife who wants to know whether or not I really am too poor to pay alimony, then that system darn well better be able to know that the person who's allowed to access my salary data is me and not my angry ex-second wife. So this middle box on the top is really important because the online app has to know for risk mitigation purposes to what extent the credential or the user presenting itself is who that person really is, or is who that machine really is. So the resource, so in this flow chart, let's just say that the resource determines that there is insufficient trustworthiness in the credential or the assertion of identity, because this is about trust elevation. If in a true flow chart, there would be another arrow coming off the resource assesses trustworthiness box, and that would go to yes, and then none of this would be. It would all be off this page and eating popcorn while we talk. So in our flow, the resource determines that there is insufficient trustworthiness in the assertion, and then follow the arrow. It should be a blinking arrow or a dancing arrow. The resource engages a previously determined trust elevation process. Frequently, and the best example of this is when I go to log in to my bank portal because I want to see whether my paycheck, my electronic paycheck, has been posted. And so I fire up my computer and I log into to CapitalOne.com, and I put in a user ID password pair, which is a one-factor authentication device, as you know, something your user ID password pair. And the portal says, "Welcome in, Peter, and what do you want to look at?" What I don't see, according to according to U.S. banking, one factor is not sufficient. But what's happening is that the bank site, the bank portal, is looking to see if it's ever seen that computer before. And the combination of a returning machine that they know is the machine they've seen before, plus the user ID password, are two factors, right? So they've elevated their trust in me because they know I'm coming from my plain, the usual computer. They can tell that either by checking the DNS that comes in, or by seeing that there's a cookie on my machine that they have seen before, and the web browser handles that. There are other things that they do, but these are the obvious things. Now, if in fact, and here's where trust elevation is even more obvious, if in fact I'm in, I have taken a business trip to Frankfurt, and I've got my office laptop with me, and I don't have my own personal machine, but I still want to go in and see whether my paycheck has arrived so I can buy all those tchotchkes in the gift shops. Well, I go to CapitalOne.com and I log in with my user ID password, and all of a sudden, the website does something that I haven't seen before. It presents me with a question. In 1952, did you live at this address or that address? And then, then it asks me a few other questions. What kind of car did you buy in 1986? That kind of thing. And it goes through 2 or 3 or 4 of those. And I have to answer those questions. That's knowledge-based authentication. That is a trust elevation technique. And the reason they did that is because they've never seen that Office laptop before. It doesn't have a cookie. It's a different DNS. I'm sitting in Frankfurt. For all they know, I'm a Russian hacker or a German hacker, right? But they engage with these questions that come from one of the data aggregators, one or more of the data aggregators. That's a trust elevation technique. If I successfully answer all their questions, or as many of the questions, 4 out of 5 or 3 out of 4, then they'll say, well, then we believe that we have sufficient confidence that you really are you, even if you're on a different device. And then they either, then what happens is they'll allow me access to the resource, or they'll reject. I only got 2 right out of 5, and they'll say, not good enough, sorry, and they'll log me out. Or, and this is the odd one, the third option is they'll say, well, he got 3 out of 6, which doesn't quite fit our profile, or 3 out of 5, which is not quite enough for us to really trust him. But since we're customer-oriented, and we don't want to just shut him out on the odd chance that he really is who he is and doesn't remember what he did 2 weeks ago, let alone 6 years ago, we'll go through another trust elevation process, and they do some other sort of technique, or they ask a different set of questions. But whatever it is, they reapply trust elevation until they can determine with their own assessment of confidence, which is something that's built into their business process, either reject or accept. So this is the core model for trust elevation and how that works. I'm sorry if I'm stating the obvious. I'm trying to at least entertain myself while I'm doing it. So let's talk for a minute about the Trust Elevation Technical Committee that decided to work on this issue. We decided that there was going to be a process, and the process that we were going to follow was to put together a phase 1, which was to collect the current and imminent trust elevation methods that are out there in the wild or about to be out there in the wild. I gave an example with the banks and KDA and cookies and DNS monitoring as examples of trust elevation techniques that are widely used in today's online environment. And of course, this could be called, all of the background research that you do as a standard analytic process. And then we put together, at the end of phase 1, we put together a document which is essentially an inventory of all of these things, of all of these methods. And then in phase 2, we analyzed the collection of methods. We analyzed that inventory of methods and processes to determine in what ways they increased trust, they elevated trust, how they worked. And in phase 3, what we did is, what we're doing and what we're asking you to look at is we have distilled from the work of the phase 2 analysis some principles, and we've applied those principles to a number of trust schemes. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's the phase 3 deliverable. Looks like we're going to do a phase 4, but we'll talk about that at another time, because really we're here trying to finish up phase 3. Now, where did we get all of this information that we put into these 3 documents? We got them from the members of the technical committee. And the next slide, I'll show you what companies and associations are represented and for the sources. So you can see that we got a broad input on that. The general whines and fusses that we disregarded is that there was too much NIST, U.S. government NIST coloration in it, and in fact the baseline we used for our general principle, for generating our general principles, was not founded on or not rooted in NIST think. It was rooted in ISO and ITUT think. X.1224 from ITU-T is in fact the baseline that we used in the general principles document, phase 3. Also, we disregarded any fusses about whether this method of trust elevation was confined to credential-based transactions only. In fact, trust elevation is applied for both credential-based authentication as well as transactional trust-based authentication, where the trust in the, and let me just take a minute now. Okay, let me take a minute to tell you what that's about. In credential-based trust, the trustworthiness of the assertion of identity comes with the credential. And the relying party trusts the assertion of identity in the credential to a greater or lesser degree based upon its trust of the issuer and the issuer's process and the technology of the credential. So a user ID password, which is and sent in the clear, is easily hacked, is easily vulnerable to all kinds of fraud and hacking and whatnot. So that's a very low trust technology. If it's issued, and if it's issued, if the issuer does a high degree of ID proofing, in other words, you have to go into the bank's offices, sit down with a bank person and show a driver's license or a passport, and this person looks at the picture and looks at you, or takes a thumbprint or an iris scan, and then takes down all your particulars. That's a high degree of trust in the proofing process. The credential technology sucks. The proofing process is good. You can replace that low-level user ID password with any number of different assertions, electronic technologies such as digital certificates or one-time password or sample assertions or OpenID assertions or OpenID Connect schemes. Doesn't matter. ID proofing, credential technology, credential management, right? So the trustworthiness in this particular family, trustworthiness of the credential resides, trustworthiness of the identity resides in the credential. Again, I'm probably telling you stuff you know, but I just want to make sure. In the transactional model, the relying party is not really too concerned with the trustworthiness of the credential or the processes by which the issuer gives the credential to a user, because the relying party itself does a number of tests to assure itself that the user coming in actually is who the credential says it is, or the user coming in is actually who the user says it is. There are a number of anonymous identity schemes out there in the wild that people use. I mean, frankly, an OpenID kind of user ID password pair from Google or Yahoo or PayPal doesn't necessarily have to represent who you are. You could be Mickey Mouse at yahoo.com, and we're all pretty sure that nobody really is Mickey Mouse. They may behave in that way, but they're not really Mickey Mouse. But if Mickey Mouse at yahoo.com comes into my application or my portal, I don't really care, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if there's a cookie there. I'm going to check to see that I've seen before. I'm going to hit them with some KBA and see whether I've seen that one before. I'm going to engage in a number of other potential techniques. I might just look to see where your machine is physically located in GPS and geolocation as a method. And so when the transactional model, the trustworthiness that the trust the relying party has that the applicant coming in is who he says he is, doesn't come from the reliability of the credential. It comes from the trust in the number of techniques that the RP applies to that transaction. by itself to determine whether or not it knows you and you are who you say you are. All right. So on the credential side, the credential, the trustworthiness is mobile. It comes with the credential and it's based on the processes of the issuer. In the transactional, it comes from processes and activities that the actual application or line party or portal implements at the time of login. And that's not portable, and that's not interoperable. That doesn't go to other places. That stays with your RP and you do it. Okay. Next slide is there. These are the companies and organizations that are participants in this technical committee, and this is the base from which we gathered the information that we put into the first, into all of our deliverables. These people representing these organizations, and there were about 5 or 6 unaffiliated individuals from the bottom of the list on the right side. So as you can see, U.S. government, academia, number of U.S. government, international international organizations, New Zealand government's there, a number of companies from a wide variety of verticals, as well as those companies in the identity management space like CA Technologies and Oracle. So there was a broad environment from which to gather and to test. So let's just turn to the Phase 3 document at this point. Dee, do we have any questions so far?
We do have one. Would you like to go ahead and take it now?
Yeah, because I've been doing all the background stuff, and I'm going to move into the document. So let's do that.
Okay, here's a great question. Is trust elevation the same as step-up authentication?
Yes, absolutely.
And that's a complete answer, right?
I could obfuscate it some more if you'd like.
That'd be great.
Okay, yeah, it's the same thing. Step-up authentication is, in fact, trust elevation, just 2 different words. Let me see, where are we? Okay, so let's talk about the Phase 3 document, which is the distillation of the analytic, the results of the analyses from Phase 3, which is based on the inventory of processes from Phase 1. There is a skeleton to the Phase 3 document. It's formed from these following elements: a methodology for aligning various different trust models. There's a mistrust model. There's an ISO trust model. There's an ITU trust model. There are proprietary trust models. But what we did is we felt that we needed to have a methodology or something that would allow people to crosswalk. So people operating in under one model would be able to translate their the trustworthiness of a transaction that's based from another model. And so they would be able to have crosswalks from one to the other, which would enable interoperability and interoperable trust, which is what this is all about. The methodology was increased trust in an asserted online identity equals increased mitigation of risk of fraud, hacking, or other mal behaviors. Increased trust equals increased mitigation of risk. Therefore, trust elevation or step-up authentication equals risk mitigation. Increased risk mitigation. That formed the heart of the methodology for creating the general principles. Then we needed a benchmark, something that we could align all of the different models against, and it had to be risk vector based, and it had to be international. And so, in other words, what we were looking for was some sort of benchmark that was based on risks to authentication, and that was global. It wasn't unique to either an industry or a nation or a continent. Presumably, it is unique to a planet, but we'll worry about that some other time. Who knows? And then we needed to have, and we wanted to have, a tool for associating trust models against the benchmark and a tool for crosswalking requirements among different trust models, just what I said. That's why we did what we did. And we have a table. We've generated a table that does just that. And that's part of the Phase 3 document. And then finally, we felt we had to come up with a recommendation for what constitutes trust elevation, what constitutes step up. And that was based on, and frankly, that's based on how multi-factor authentication works. Multi-factor authentication works by mitigating a risk that the first factor does not mitigate. That's how two-factor is more reliable than one factor, and that's how three-factor is more reliable than two-factor, because it mitigates risks that aren't covered, and we'll talk about that. All right. So this is the skeleton of the Phase 3 document. There's a methodology, a benchmark, a tool, and a recommendation. My machine is running very slowly. I think it's doing while I'm here, I think it's doing a security scan. Okay, so here's a method. Here's a graphic for those of us who are, not verbal. As you can tell from my presentation, I babble. The methodology of risk vectors and mitigation of risk vectors. There's a benchmark, which is the ITUT and ISO X.1254 list of risk vectors. That's what the benchmark is. What are the risks to authentication, to online authentication? And then a recommendation, what elevates trust, and then the tool, which is the table that allows crosswalking. Next. So here's the methodology that we came to for the recommendation of the general principle. Because the set of risk vectors, risks to authentication, risks accepted by relying parties when they authenticate a user online, is more or less common to all the identity management standards, whether it's ISO or NIST or ITU or the government of the UK or the EU or the Japanese pharmaceutical industry or the Singapore Economic Consortium or anything else. The set of risks is more or less common. And for that reason, we chose to use the ITUT X.1254 catalog of risk vectors as the standard list, the benchmark, and then to prune that list down to only those that affected authentication risks, because that 1254 addresses a lot of risks that are not authentication oriented. The reason we chose 1254 is, one, it represents more or less the best international thinking by a global a bunch of people who know what they're talking about. And secondly, because it was fairly, it was pretty comprehensive. The risks listed are a pretty comprehensive list. We didn't really feel that it missed anything. And finally, this list, we use this list as the baseline against which trust elevation methods have been arrayed in the table. So under each of these schemes, various schemes, there are elevation techniques or risk mitigation techniques. And we arrayed them all against the 1254 catalog of risks. That's the core of this document. And then here is the recommendation. Based upon an assessment of the state of the art by the TC membership that you've seen, trust in the transaction is increased by what may be comparable to one NIST level of assurance. You know, that is, the important word there is comparable. We know that the NIST levels of assurance are fairly well documented and out there. They're not the only ones, as we have pointed out in the table. But trust in the transaction is increased by what may be comparable to one NIST level of assurance when one trust elevation technique satisfies either of the following criteria. The technique mitigates a different threat vector. We've already seen this 2 or 3 times. This is, you know, kind of, you already know this. This becomes self-evident as you think through the process. The technique mitigates a different threat vector, implementing an additional factor which doesn't share the same vulnerability as the factors previously engaged. Or the technique leads to increase in confidence in an existing factor by enhancing a mitigation strategy applied previously. So if that's really a weasel phrase, and we're going to have to test that one. But let's just use the example of identity proofing. When I proof you online, which is to say I have you fill out a questionnaire online and I ask you 3 questions, I have a certain assurance, and you pass, I have a certain degree of assurance that you are who you say you are, even though I've never seen you. All I see is your responses to my questions. When you show up in person and I look at your face and I look at your passport picture, that enhances the proofing strategy without, and I could do that, if that's the proofing technique, then I'm satisfied that to a greater degree that you are who you say you are, because I've mitigated the risk that your online proofing, what's the word I want? That your online proofing has. All right, so you can spoof an identity online more easily than you can spoof an identity in person, in general. Now, I know that there are, now the reason that I say that this is weasel, a little weaselly, I like the first bullet a lot better than the second, but a reason I say that this is a little weaselly is because it can be argued that if in fact I proof you online and I say, oh, this is good for 82% or 78%, and then you show up 6 months later at at my offices and I ask for your driver's license, you show it to me, and I look at your face and they seem to match, and the new mustache you've grown doesn't do a thing for your image, especially if you're a woman. It could be argued that while that is increasing confidence in a current, in a previously enabled strategy, it could also be argued that it's a second factor. So as far as I'm concerned, the second technique leads to an increase in confidence in an existing factor. May in fact be a legitimate criterion, but it still needs to be tested, whereas the first bullet is rock solid. And so, all right, so I'm making a personal comment in there. And finally, before we go into the next slide, I wanted to stop for a second and tell you why you should care about this, why you should care about the work of the Trust Elevation Technical Committee, and why you should care about this third deliverable. This third deliverable creates a generalizable framework for implementing non-credential-based and online authentication best practices based on current and near-future implementation. So what it does is it creates a framework around what's currently happening, so it's extensible to current financial services audited practice and modifiable as new approaches to mitigation risks appear. So it's open-ended, so new strategies for risk mitigation fit right in because, in fact, new strategies to mitigate risk are there to, or put in place to mitigate the current or the comprehensive inventory of risks and risk vectors. So what it does is it helps your lawyers if you should get challenged. It expands and extends the options for multi-factor authentication. So if if the senior VP for security has said, well, our process has always been to hit KDA if we don't see the IP address of the device matching what we know. And you know that KBA tends to be maybe the trust in the KBA process has eroded over time for one reason or another. There are other factors that you could use, and that these other factors continue to fit into the appropriate spot. So it expands and extends your options. And you can say to the boss, look, this is not as good as it used to be because of new threats, so maybe we should look at geolocation. And this is how you do it. And this is the way it links up to what we've already been doing in a smooth way. And he says, oh, how do you know that? And you say, well, here's this OASIS principle document. Third, it creates a normalized methodology for evaluating and mapping both practices. So you could use this technique, this way of thinking, these documents, when you go to assess whether or not to trust credentials issued by entities other than yourself or your community. It's the interoperability of trust thing. And that enables trusted interoperability at the relying party policy level. And if you got it at the relying party policy level, then implementation is much easier. Finally, existing systems may be impacted if this framework is extended to a trust elevation standard in perhaps XML in the future. And then the impact would be on both identity providers and relying parties in the trust elevation systems. So it may be that that having these principles and these crosswalks out there does in fact get incorporated into standards in the future. And if it gets incorporated into standards in the future, you don't want it to be a problem for you, your operations, or your customers, and so that's why it's important to have a voice in it at the present time. Okay, so that pretty much is what I have to say about the third deliverable. I'm not going to present the third deliverable itself. Dee is going to put up the links to the document. So, you know, because their deliverable is a thick piece of stuff, and it's got the 4 elements that we said it has. So D is going to put up a slide that has the links to both the first and second deliverables and the draft of the third deliverable that we'd like your comments on. Or, you know, frankly, if you'd want to say, okay, D, if you want to say, what a great job you guys have done, and, you know, here's $100, go have lunch and drink champagne, I'm good with that.
Peter, you are always so entertaining. I appreciate that. That was great. We do have some questions, and we do have some time. So, and Abby, if you want to chime in here, that would be great. So the first question is, will we take this framework and create a protocol?
I'll answer this one. So here, just a disclaimer, you know, I'm speaking as a co-chair of this TC, and my views are my own, not of my employer. That said, yes, we will be trying to work on a protocol. This will be in the fourth deliverable. And, you know, for this webinar, we really do encourage people to help us move into that direction and provide us input. So the short answer, yes, it's in the plan.
So this may be, Peter, what you were intimating about a fourth deliverable possibly.
Exactly.
Okay. Very good. And here's another really good question. What about trust elevation by reapplying the same factor multiple times as opposed to applying a different factor, for example, possession of different hardware tokens or knowledge of multiple secrets?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Abby.
Okay. The short answer is it does not really matter, because trust elevation, at the end of the day, is the combination of reuse of a method, or, you know, preferably with non-overlapping vulnerabilities, up to satisfy the relying party. It's their risk engine, their own analytics. So now if the same credential is used within different contexts, because you can infer more information to reduce your risk, you can do that. We don't prevent you from doing that. The relying party is the policy enforcer at the end of the day. Peter, did I mess it up?
No, I think that's a fair statement, Abby. I'd just like to add to it that if reapplication of the same factor again and again does not mitigate the risk any further, then it doesn't really help. But it does, but that method does really speak to the second bullet. So I wouldn't say absolutely no, but I certainly wouldn't want to put my my retirement fund behind that.
Okay, great. Here's another one. How does the user experience confusion factor compare between trust elevation and assurance techniques?
Peter, would you take that?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it.
I could take a step and then you can correct me. To be honest with you, if it's done right, you know, we should minimize the user interference here. At the end of the day, you know, the user experience is important, and depending on, like, at least like from financial services, for example, you would like to see or gather information, and you only involve the user when you need to. For example, geolocation, expected profile, expected behavior, the same device or not, same type of time of day of interaction. So the more points you look at, you know, the more confidence you get. The idea behind it is how can you combine this to get into the proper risk analysis and risk reduction. If you're still not sure, you can go ahead and involve the user by asking for another password or PIN or KPA questions or more questions. Peter?
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying, Abby. I want to be a little more pointed. We all know that that the greatest vulnerability in any transaction is the mental capability of the end user. And living and working in Washington, D.C., I'm an expert on confused people. So I would say that certainly any technique, whether it's credential-based or transaction-based, that runs the risk of confusing Aunt Millicent is going to be problematic. That's an interesting question that I think we need to talk about some more. So maybe if you would, you who asked the question, sir/madam, would drop us a line with that question in it. I'd like to kind of chew on that some more.
Sure, I can send that to you guys. We'll take care of it. Can we spend a few minutes and talk a little bit about how this work relates to the FIDO Alliance?
Sure. Abby.
Okay. So, you know, the FIDO Alliance, they are trying to come up with a universal means of exchanging a second factor or interoperable means of having multi-factor authentications communicated. So the way we can view this, that they are implementing a specific solution. Our work of this TC is one step higher up. If you get all those factors, how you can combine them effectively to have a systematic means to come up with some LOA number. So there is no conflict between what the FIDO Alliance is doing. You could view that the FIDO Alliance, they're doing a pipeline, and we are providing the framework where this pipeline will be used. We would, you know, FIDO Alliance is a step in the right direction, and you know, I think their solution, you know, could be what a good sector of this industry needs. And I don't see any conflict. Actually, we see them as complementary, and it validates what this TC is working on. Peter?
Yep, I'm good. I'm good.
That was easy. Okay, another great question. And this person has not read all the documentation, but I think it's a nice conversation to have. Does the document framework address practices for audit or best techniques for integrating with applications while preserving security? Similarly, should elevation transaction details be retained for audit and forensics? Really good question. This is a big data provenance problem. It's a lot there.
I can take a step, and then Peter, if you could, it will be great. The short answer, you know, this is a tool that will help you through your audit. You know, all what you want to do, most of the audit issues that come in terms of compliance, have you been doing things systematically? Can you justify your reasoning, and then you document the reasoning to meet a given audit issue or requirement for compliance. So in a way, you know, we're not going to tell you what you need to do to comply. That's not what this TC intend to do. However, if you can document that systematically we do this review, systematically we look at this authentication data path, systematically this is how we try to comply with this PCI requirements, you know, for data security, and you know, and these are our numbers. Systematically, we look at these vulnerabilities, and since we would like to have a non-overlapping vulnerability, we are patching here, patching here, patching here, updating this, this, and that, and the overall risk values go down. This is, how this work can be used for. The intention is not to replace your current audit or, compliance processes. In terms of the application, how to use it for app developers, I think if you're doing your application security right, there should be separation between the security layer and the app itself. This will be a requirement on the app, on the security layer within the application, to what to do in a systematic way to elevate the trust in a consistent manner across multiple applications. So you can have a normalized way of achieving higher trust. This could help you because you can have a more meaningful meaning of what a security number means if you want to. Peter?
Yeah, I would add a couple of things. First of all, I would add that audit processes and requirements for systems are usually covered by either in the U.S. government would be a FISMA analysis, and internationally would be an ISMS, for example. Those methodologies and those processes have their own audit requirements, and the requirements in under those schemes are laid out in the table. So it's not like these principles need to have an additional layer of auditing requirements or behaviors. Those are inherent in the schemes that match up in the columns of the table, and the rows of the table are the risk vectors. So you have the risk vectors, you have mitigation strategies under each, as defined under each one of these schemes, ISMS and FISMA and whatnot. And the audit requirements and processes are documented within the schemes themselves and don't need to be in here. The second part of the question relating to the separation between the authentication process and the authorization process by the application is very interesting. The managers or the policy element of the relying party application is where the determination of risk and risk mitigation is done. And part of the risk factors is the requirements for determination of requirements for trustworthiness of the user, and that includes the domain in which the transaction occurs. Does it occur? Is it required to be inside a VPN that's being protected by FIPS 140-2 level 3 HSM encrypted key or not, for just two examples. And in that case, what you see that there are actually three parties to the workflow. There is the authentication module, where all of the stuff that we've been talking about occurs, and then there is the authorization module that's at the back end that says, all right, if these conditions are satisfied, which in fact may include addition of extended attributes that are not part of the identity assertion, such as your credit card number for eBay or PayPal. And then the third piece of the workflow is the way in which the authentication module transfers information, not just data, but information to the application, which then makes the authorization decision. Of course, the application can proxy out authorization to the authentication module if you want, and then it becomes, you know, there's XACTML and there's, you know, other schemes that like OpenID Connect, which would do both authentication and authorization. But that third element and how the authentication box passes information to the relying party app box is part of the general workflow, and it's part of the risk mitigation requirements. Dee?
That's great. You guys are always entertaining. Last call for questions. I think we've gotten through the questions. If you do have follow-up questions, I will respond to those and circulate them to the technical committee, and I promise to get back to you again. This has been recorded. I will send you a link to the recorded version as soon as it is up. Peter, Abby, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to present today. I really appreciate it. And for all the attendees that joined us today, thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.